Great, thanks. And we are recording this event, so feel free to turn your cameras off if you would prefer not to be recorded. When we start these events, we like to say and begin with, welcome to our house. You are in my home. I'm currently living in a storeroom in my parents' garden. And sometimes it's difficult to explain what we do as Decolonising Economics because we are an emerging organisation. But I guess ultimately, for the purpose of this talk, we seek to contribute to the movement for reparations. And we do this in the knowledge of honouring the 500-year struggle for racial justice. You can read more about us online and the kind of background of our work for us not to have to go into too much depth there. We're an unregistered grassroots collective and have been for the last 3 years. And we've just begun setting up the motion process to establish as a worker co-op and think about being more sustainable into the future. Before we begin, I just want to introduce the whole team. So Noni, my partner in crime, who was playing the tracks and leading us through the slides, is waving at you right now. Sophie, who you heard from just now, is a long-term DE collaborator for whom without we would have never have launched this crowdfunder. So we're ever grateful for Sophie. Ola, who is our fantastic tech supporter and is here to help you if you drop off, lose sound, lose captions, or have any other concerns. And you can chat to Ola on the chat box, as well as get in touch with us on the inbox. This session is being recorded. We had made all attempts to get a BSL interpreter, which we had not managed to. We hope the captions can support people to access the event. We will be transcribing the recording and making it accessible, and also hopefully in the future turning it into a graphic novel or a graphic recording. So look out for that a bit later. And if you are tweeting, multiple hashtags that you can use. So the team are going to share them in the chat box now. Decolonising Futures, racial justice, caste, class and capitalism, bit of a tongue twister, and team are also going to share all of the handles for all of the speakers right now. So we absolutely love co-ops, and so much of our vision for bringing about a just transition involves the expansion of democratically owned workplaces, homes and services. And this is why these events contribute to our crowdfunder. I'm going to share the link for the crowdfunder and you can read more about that strategy in there. Yeah. To introduce Decolonising Futures, this is a series of lunchtimes events that we've been dreaming about running for over a year now, and much of the content and questions have bubbled up through our explorations and organising for a just transition with some of our favourite racial justice organisers across the UK. And I mentioned before that we have been dreaming about these conversations for many months. The reason that exploring racial hierarchies is so central to our work is because it enables us to understand how the colonial mindset, so that's, I can't even like point to it, but it's basically just under the extractive economy. There you go, thanks, Noni. How the colonial mindset operates within racialized communities, and how patterns of wealth can also reflect who is responsible for perpetuating casteism, anti-blackness, Islamophobia, transphobia, class prejudice, and ableism in our movements. And all of this is really central for us because if you look at the bottom of that strategy framework, in order to move out of the extractive economy towards a living economy, we all must organise through a values filter of intersectional justice. And so part of this conversation sort of sits within the values filter. The strategy framework for just transition was developed by an organisation called Movement Generation, and it is basically like the bedrock of decolonising economics work, and we operate around that framework in all the different projects and organisations we do. Racial hierarchies. Sorry, I'm going to really try and move forward on this because we're losing time on the speakers, but I want to give you some context into this conversation. So next slide. The things that prompted this discussion transparently were personal questions that I've been holding about my family's background, how my identity is often in conflict with my personal mission to smash the white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy and to move towards justice and liberation. And in designing strategies for working decolonising economics, whilst also existing as a cis heteronormative middle class enabled person, have had to learn a whole load of shit about what I'm responsible for. And there are many things that, that we can explore here. The first, I've got 3 things that kind of have prompted me to think about this. I feel are really useful to describe, particularly where my identity sits. So next slide. This is a image of the Runnymede Trust's report, Colour of Money, which shows wealth inequality across different identities. It's not a perfect example of what is in motion, because even within a British Indian identity, and we'll go into this more, there are lots of complexities, but it's a kind of overview of how close the Indian identity, the British Indian identity, is to whiteness, and there is a historical reason for this. And then there's a historical reason for kind of extracted wealth from other community identities within the racialized communities. So we'll be exploring that. The next is challenging the idea of the BAME experience. So a lot of you last year will have seen this. Next slide. That there's some kind of progress on racial equity, because as if like going to Oxford is a sort of indicator for progress on racial equity in the first place, but also that the kind of pulling all racialized communities into one box without really interrogating who sits behind that again, kind of has this veneer of that something progressive is happening when it's not. And finally, probably the most problematic is this, which is the fact that we have one of the most fascist, corrupt capitalist cabinets of my lifetime, full of the model immigrant, that leaves me feeling, yeah, yucky is such a great way to describe it. So yeah, that's kind of where this conversation comes in. So without more further ado, I'm really just, holding to some of that in the session. I want to introduce you to many ways in which the colonial history of these different communities has shaped racial wealth inequality. And I'm really excited about introducing the first speaker. So we've got, next slide, we've got Nish and Kelsey and Claude, who are gonna speak with you. And I'm just gonna introduce Nish really quickly before bringing them in. So, and I'm gonna find my introductory bits. Nish is a community builder, dreamer, and all-round geek. They are a queer disabled person from a middle-class Gujarati Jain background. They grew up across the world and have a special interest in understanding processes, power, and privilege, and dreaming of ways to build colonial futures. They have been a grassroots organizer on food and climate justice for over a decade. And I'm just gonna invite Nish, so we can get rid of the slides, I think, and invite Nish into the speaker position. Yeah, and ask you the first question. So when we were kind of communicating about this event, Nish, you mentioned that it touched on many taboo subjects within the South Asian community, and I felt that was really important and so true. I just want you to expand a little on why you feel that this conversation is important to have.
Hi, I'm Nish, that's just for Otter. Yeah, I think I was actually really excited when you emailed me, because I was like, this is the stuff I really want to be talking about, but we don't often get a chance to talk about it because there's this idea of a like united front that we have to present to whiteness. But there were kind of 2 key reasons why I think this conversation is really important. And the first is kind of about what being Indian actually means. And that kind of relates to sort of silent subjects like caste, but also how like that is a really strange ethnic category in the British census, because it's a whole nation that's kind of put into one group. And the other aspect is like how there is a long and ongoing aspiration within some South Asian communities of whiteness, and how that's historically situated. I think in terms of like the taboo and silent subjects like caste, so one of the things is a lot of data disappears under sort of national identities when they're used as ethnic identities, because those aren't the same thing. And under the sort of Indian national category, caste is vitally missing. And I think further to that, as caste has been actively erased by dominant Indian community groups. For example, there was an amendment to the UK Equality Act, which acknowledged caste discrimination as an issue, which was then heavily lobbied against by prominent Sikh, Jain and Hindu communities, even though, for example, the Jain community that I grew up in has always argued that caste doesn't exist under Jainism, but I've learned through experience that that's not true, and it's kind of been a process to understand that as well. But then again, in 2018, when after all this lobbying, Theresa May decided that caste wouldn't be a category in the Equality Act. And this is despite a really strong and condemning report in 2010 by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research on specifically on caste discrimination. So, and I think there's one thing about it, how the language that's used to argue against caste is very similar to like sort of the arguments against critical race theory today. Like it's a lot of caste blindness. So it's like, oh, but caste doesn't exist anymore, or caste was invented by the British colonizers. And like this whole idea that somehow by actually acknowledging that caste discrimination exists in the UK, it will actually make it real and mean that those communities suddenly have to be accountable for their actions. The other aspect is sort of like the ongoing aspiration between of South Asianness and whiteness. And I think, yeah, your picture of those specific cabinet members was very much on point. And I particularly have a strong dislike of Priti Patel because I always wonder if I would have ended up like her, because we have a similar sort of background and like kind of see her as like the opposite who I am, hopefully. But there's also like a longer history around like, so I studied as an archaeologist, and like there's a whole story around the myth making that justified British colonialism. They did this across the world. But in India, there's like this idea of this Aryan or Aryan invasion, which is how the Hindus and the Brahmins were brought over to India to kind of civilize them. And they came with horsepower, and somehow horsepower is very important to British colonizers, but that's a whole other story. But the thing is, like, despite the fact that archaeologically it's disputed because there's no evidence for it, it's still taught in Indian schools as a norm, and like within it there's a whole basis for like Brahmin supremacy, which actually echoes narratives of white supremacy, because it's all about Aryans who came from Europe and then created civilization, and that Indians and Dravidians and basically dark-skinned people from the south of India were always like inferior to the superior North Indian sort of groups. And I think it's most famously, at least like in a British context, it's most famously kind of represented in Goodness Gracious Me, where there's like a sketch where there is an uncle or a dad, or I can't really remember, but every single time there's anything new that's kind of like famous, like Greek marbles or whatever, he'll just point out and go, that's Indian, like to everything, because that's the kind of level of like thinking is like Indians are superior, and they're superior to white people, but they're also trying to suck up to white people. It's a very strange relationship.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that idea, the first idea that you presented, which was so coming from a Punjabi Sikh family, that there's no casteism within that. And then I was like, but why do people have identified different names? And you know, that obviously isn't the case. So thank you. You've also actually addressed the second question, but I just wanted you mentioned loads of amazing activists working in classism in the UK, so I just wanted to give you a bit of space to kind of highlight them before going on to the third question.
So I'll actually be sharing a document with you, Guppi and Noni, because I can't list all of them, and I really need to write them down, and it's not really, so I'll probably try and make a short list, which you guys can send out or share with the event. But there's amazing work going on. But I think I just realized I haven't really discussed what caste is. So I should probably explain that. So caste is basically a way sanctioned by the Manusmriti in particular, which is a Hindu text, that created a feudal hierarchy of South Asian societies. It places Brahmins, who are spiritual leaders, at the top, followed by warriors, who include kings, then merchants, then laborers, and underneath all of those you have what is sometimes called untouchables or Dalits, who were tasked with doing work which is seen as impure and like dirty, like death rites, cleaning sewage systems, and still do. You also have numerous communities who don't belong to that, like, or those structures, like indigenous communities, or as they're called, Adivasis. And it's not just about work, it's also about culture, where you could live, what clothes you could wear, who you could eat with. Like Dalits aren't allowed to eat with like Savarna, which are anyone above them, basically. And also what specifically they could eat as well and what was allowed. So it's cemented into like all forms of cultural identity. It's not just about like, it's not echoing the class system in that way. And I guess you were going to ask about how the British kind of influenced this, and I'm not sure if there's time, but I can give a brief description, which is just that, like, obviously it's really, really complicated, and the history of like colonialism in India is really complicated because you don't just have British colonialism, you also have like Portuguese, you have German, you have lots of different within that, and I guess the way the British liked to define things was to categorize, and that's actually the thing the Europeans colonizers did, is they categorized entire communities and they wanted to build that system. And basically they they just basically use this categorizing system, which they asked the Brahmins to inform them, to entirely define communities. So there's like, I was just speaking to a friend yesterday about the Criminal Tribes Act, which is like an entire groups of tribes or communities who are considered habitual criminals, and so had to register under the British system because they were seen as like, what's the right word? Just like wrong in many ways under that system. So I think what the British really did is they solidified this caste system into a legal system, and that's the change that happened, rather than it being more loose and like sort of fluid between communities. But yeah, I would say that the caste discrimination still exists, and also that it also affects how migrant stories to Britain come about in terms of like migratory stories. So you have sort of indentured laborers who were sent across to lots of different parts of the world after the abolition of slavery to basically do the work to have free labor, which isn't necessarily called slavery in those explicit terms. So that's from Malaysia to the Caribbean, but also have like the arrival of like richer kind of migrants, for example, to East Africa, where they were encouraged to arrive. And that's kind of my background, is that richer kind of story of like being able to have businesses and slowly build into like being a very prominent part of the East African community today in a very racist way. So I think those migratory stories of how Indians arrived to the UK is important in terms of also understanding the dynamics of like who is actually who's been allowed into the UK and like who faces those forms of discrimination, I guess.
Definitely. I was supposed to mention at the beginning that we ran this event not because we feel, or I feel like I know this subject, but like this is really a learning process for me as well. And coming as a learner, like you've just offered so much. Thank you so much, Nish. I have one last question for you before we move on to Claude, which is among many, many things, you are a long-standing climate justice organizer. And I was really interested to know how understanding casteism and classism informs your global solidarity actions on climate justice.
I think it's been a journey. I mean, I grew up my high school years in Australia as a settler on Noongar lands. So a lot of my knowledge has been informed by my understanding of settler colonialism in the Australian context. And I think one of the key things that directly links like casteism, classism, and Indigenous sovereignty is like the example of Adani. Adani is like Gautam Adani is like one of the two big leaders around Modi, business leaders who's basically used all forms of legislation to basically do whatever he wants to make more money. But he's also built a coal mine in what we now call Australia on Wangan and Jagalingou people's lands, where the Queensland government actually removed native title to build and give permission for that coal mine. So there's a direct link there of like Indian colonization, but at the same time, he's also a big part of Kashmiri land grabs, which have happened since section, I think it was 370 was removed from Kashmir. So and also like numbers of stories of around like Adivasi and like forest lands being stolen from indigenous communities in India for the sake of like open cast mining, and just no environmental interest in actively lobbying against any form of environmental legislation. So I think understanding like the complexity of all these issues and understanding that race doesn't work in a strict hierarchy as we like to imagine it in this sort of simplistic way, and is actually informed by many complex processes, is a big part of how I'd like to think about climate justice, because I also understand myself as being a settler and also being privileged within specific communities, but also understanding my place under white supremacy. So, I mean, it's something I've learned to kind of be uncomfortable, like comfortably uncomfortable with, if that makes sense. And just trying to work. But I've personally tried to like influence family and my community, and it's just not, it's a difficult one to really change when you're like a queer person who doesn't fit into like the norms of my society, like is automatically an easy, it's difficult, put it that way.
Yeah. Thanks, Nish. We appreciate everything that you bring to this conversation and to the movement, and we'll come back to you towards the end of the event for the final questions. I'm going to pass on to Claude. So I've got a little intro for Claude, which I'm going to find now. This is from your LinkedIn. I'm just going to say it, but we've got 12 minutes to like get through a lot of I really want to get moving. But Claude was born to Nevisian parents in Leeds in 1960, and he lived all his life in Chapeltown. He's actively been involved in professionally and voluntary work in his community since the age of 14, involved in regeneration, housing, construction, education, youth clubs, youth mentoring. It doesn't even say like a fraction of the stuff that you do. So I'm just going to prompt you with the first question.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, you are a proud Chapeltown resident, and I love that the Leeds West Indian Centre is the link that you're directed to on your Twitter bio. And among all the other identities you have in the community as a community organiser, I just love for you to tell us a little bit about the area that you grew up in Leeds, your own story of life in Chapeltown, and its history.
Wow. Right. Thank you for the invite to speak today. The last speaker was really interesting. I found that caste stuff is something that I'm interested in, but we'll go to that. I don't want to lose my 4 minutes and my 12 minutes. Claude Hendrickson. Yeah, I am a proud Chapeltownian, born here. I'll come to a little bit about that when you talk to the second question. But yes, being born in Chapeltown here, my first learning, I often say the first thing I had to learn was the difference between Irish people, English people, Welsh people, and Scottish people. And that is sometimes when we even categorize white people, we need to break them down as well. Because when you go back to the beginning of history, it was like no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So I just wanted to throw that in. Yes, I've lived in Chapeltown all my life. I remember one time they did a bit of research into the number of ethnic groups that live in Chapeltown. And I think this is way back in the late 80s, early 90s, they were saying there were 72 different ethnic groups that lived in Chapeltown. So 72, that's, breaking it right down. And I'd also like to say, when I was going to school on the back of the last speaker, that it's quite funny that when we was going to school, we had Indian friends and Pakistani friends. And that all changed with history, but again, that's another discussion, because the South Asian, as they're termed now, that came from Africa, added a different dynamics to what was the Pakistanis and Indians that lived in Leeds. It's strange. Anyway, my story, being born in Leeds, I went to a primary school, for example, that was 95% African, Caribbean and Asian population. This is way back in the 60s. I ended up in a high school in All Woodley, which was 3% Black children and 97% white children. So I went from one extreme to the next extreme, even within education. We were a generation that protested against the first headmaster in Leeds in 1972 because we thought they were racist. And like I said, I've been involved in activities within the community since 1974 when I was 14. Involved in the first race riot that happened in 1975, Bonfire Night 1975, which I suppose was that first generation coming of age, getting to 14, 15 and challenging the unequal society that we lived in. And they had a riot which we saw as a civil protest, standing up for our rights, what was right, what was wrong within the system that we was living in. Like I said, I grew up in Chapeltown. My father left me when I was 2 years old, went back to the Caribbean. That left me to be brought up by my mother. And living in Chapeltown, it was a changing thing, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And I suppose our main thing was first fighting for equal education, because we felt that education that was being delivered. And sometimes I say, when our parents came here, they were poor white people living in the system in the UK. And our parents came here, and I often mention that postal discrimination is a tool as much as racial discrimination is, in that migrating people were put into poor postal areas within the city. So for example, Chapeltown historically had been an area of the city where in-transit people were settled first. So the Jews, the Eastern Europeans, then the African Caribbeans, then the Indians, and it keeps going right down to the Vietnamese, to the Bangladeshis. Chapeltown and Hierarchies historically had been an area where so-called working class white people lived, and we were thrown in with them. And that also made us believe that we are a group of people that, in theory, should vote Labour. But when our parents came here, the unions and the Labour Party were, they were the task forces. They were the ones that came down on us. It was the working class white people that were down on the black people, stealing their jobs, stealing their wives. So yes, and with them, we as African Caribbean people, originally we were West Indians. We were called West Indians. We've over the years come to the term that we're African Caribbean because we're not from the West. The Caribbean is not in the West. So this West Indian term is again another confuser. Yeah, we went on to stand up, and we had to, any changes that have happened in society have not happened because they were given to us. We've had to fight for them. So you will see there was riots of 75, the riots of 1981, the riots of 1985. So any equality, any change that has happened because of civil, in principle, disobedience, and we've moved, I believe we've moved from the argument of looking for equality rather now that we're looking for equity. We want equity now. We don't want equality. Equality for me is an old argument. It's an old fight. It's a last century fight. What we're looking at is how we can establish wealth within our community. We want equity. And I'll talk a little bit about that with my second question. I hope that's 4 minutes. I don't know if it is.
I mean, I've lost time, so it's fine. We'll make it work, so don't worry. So yeah, I mean, that's perfect. And you have actually touched on this a little bit. So you're a descendant of the Windrush generation, and I've been organising the city that, as you say, has like, well, in the UK has the third highest level of inequality. And it's also incredibly ethnic diverse, specific to your area, but also around the city.
Yeah.
Maybe particularly in the last 10 years, because, you know, that movement of people in and out of the area. Could you maybe describe a little bit about racial wealth inequality within the city, and who have been at the forefront of that wealth extraction, and how that may continue if, like, we don't address it?
Yeah, well, I'm of that first generation of children born to the Windrush generation. So my mother came here in 1958. I was born here in 1960. Now, let's start from a position. Our parents were invited by the UK government of the time to come and help build the motherland. We were not economic migrants. We were not, the African Caribbean people were not brought here because of war or because of economic situations or bad weather or anything. We were invited to the UK as citizens of the British colonialism. And so our parents came with an intention that they were coming here for 5 years, maybe, and get some money, help build the motherland and go back to the Caribbean. They came here, they got involved in the NHS, they got involved in British Rail, they got involved in a lot of the employment platforms in the UK that indigenous people would not do. And we helped rebuild the NHS, we helped rebuild the buses, we helped rebuild the British Rail. But within that rebuilding of them institutions, our people did not get any equity. They did not gain no wealth from that. In fact, they suffered, and I always say enslavement, colonialism, racism. They suffered unjust, undue racism from the indigenous poor community. It was, you know, when I think growing up here in the UK as that Windrush generation, you know, our parents and all ethnic minorities would say our parents scrimmed and scraped so that we could go to school, get school uniforms, get a basic education. They even took 2-3 jobs to pay for us to get supplementary education. That might be education outside of school. And that education outside of school, what gave us that education wealth in society. And I often say, from a free education in the UK, a free education, you don't gain anything. You know, it's that external extra, whether it's being taught a bit of maths and English by your mother, by your father, by an older sibling, by your auntie. It's that work that happens with us outside of formal education that empowers us to take the next steps forward. So as that Windrush generation, and it's been proven over the last 5-6 years with the government coming out, Theresa May coming out and saying, whoops, we're sorry. The way we have treated you for the last half of a century. And remember, 50 years is half of a century. When I went to school in the UK, when I went to primary school, I was taught by our history teacher that 100 years is a long time. And even then, I was taught, I often remember a teacher, you know, saying to me, I should be thankful that the British saved us from enslavement. Thankful for what? You know, so very much the Windrush generation, and it's come to pass after 50 years of that hostile environment. The government of Britain says, yes, we was wrong. We have treated you hot, you know, and the impact of that on the economic wealth of the African and Black community, looking at your chart with where we sit in the financial wealth, has been detrimental because of that negativity we suffered going through education, the racism and the impact of that hostile environment on that generation for half of a century. And, you know, we let them get away with it sometimes, like it's just a couple of years, but it's actually half of a century. Some people don't even live to be half of a century old, but we've taken that on. So when it comes to inequality, when it comes to history of racial wealth, I'm glad that our parents found them books, and the greatest impact has been the internet. You know, I often say in our lifetime, we were taught information is power, and the internet has opened that door. I'm proud to have opened the first community internet cafe in the city of Leeds, in Chapeltown, on Chapeltown Road, on the 4th of January 2000. So other than some of my other claims, that was important to me, that our generation of young people would have information, because information is power. I hope that's my second 4 minutes.
I'm going to ask you the most exciting part of your work for me, and I'm sure as we get to know you more and more, we'll learn more, is you leading a self-build project with a group of 12 unemployed men who built their own street. I actually listened to such a great podcast of you, and I really enjoyed it. Can you share a little bit about why that community housing, or why community housing specifically, and I think it is the one identity that you are really well known for, is so central to your racial justice organizing?
The frontline self-build, that is my, other than having children, that is my biggest, that's my proudest movement. Taking a group of unemployed Black men, because in the late 80s, we was living in a world where Black men didn't want to work. Black men were drug dealers. Black men were, everything about the Black male was negative. And I wanted to find something and do something that would prove beyond a doubt, that defeat that mentality, at least within my community. And I'd done, I took on the idea of doing a self-build, which was 92,000 bricks, 52,000 blocks. We built 12 semi-detached houses in the Roundy area of Leeds, just up there behind the Roundy pub and Tesco's. We built a street of houses, and I took these guys off of the Hayfield pub, which was a pub in Chapeltown, which was deemed as the red light, the front line. And that's why we called it front line, because we wanted to make a statement. So we named the street. And it was really about housing. Housing is central to the development of people and children. If even animals, having a roof over your head is an essential part. Where you live, where you get up every morning to go to school from, where you put your head on a night, how you sleep, is central to your motivation and how you move forward. And we lived in a society in the 60s and 70s where our parents were told, we were living in some horrible housing. When I think back, rising damp, we were given the worst houses in the worst streets. And it seems strange when I looked into the history of Black and ethnic minority people, where we come from in the Caribbean and in Africa, being involved in whether it's a mud hut, as they would call it, or whatever your accommodation was, you would naturally be involved in it. Even if you were a school teacher, if you was a lawyer, if you was a police officer, you would come home after work, put on your dirty clothes, and you'd push wheelbarrows to help build your house. So for us, it's a natural thing to be involved in building the accommodation where you live. But in England, you were told, no, you have no rights to do that. You stand in a queue, you wait until we give you a house. And in Chapeltown, I'd watched dereliction, I'd watched streets and streets of houses becoming derelict because they were badly maintained by the local authority and landlords. And it broke down areas like Chapeltown and Hare Hills. When you look back to the 60s and 70s, it was total dereliction. You'd live in a house and 2 doors down, it'd be derelict. And then for the rest of, so I wanted to challenge that. And I wanted, And then they talked about, oh, Black people didn't want to get involved in construction. And I was like, well, again, it's part of our heritage. We build, that's what we do. That's part of our life. So I wanted to prove that. So I took on this project to pull together a group of guys. We got together, got them trained. They got qualifications. We built 12 houses, a street of houses. 6 of them still live in them houses today, 25 years later. A couple of them have passed away, so they've left their share in the house to their children. So again, it was about developing some equity, so they could pass that equity on, their shared ownership. Yeah, and for me, it was really about doing something, because a lot of times, a lot of good work is done by ethnic minority communities, but you can't see it, it's not evidence. They did it 20 years ago, they did it 30 years ago, and you can't see it. And I wanted to create something you could see, touch, and feel. Yeah, growing your own food is another thing, but I'll come back to that maybe later on in the question. But yes, I really wanted to prove our natural rights to passage, that we could we wanted, our parents came here wanting to contribute, and we have contributed, and I wanted to show that within construction. So yeah, it is my one of my proudest moments, just to have that evidence. And every so often when I need a bit of reminding about what achievements can be, I go up there and walk up and down the street and think, you know, about it, and the hurdles that I went over. And my wish on a closing note was that I would have been able to take that to other postally discriminated groups, not just Black people, but white people as well. But leaving you on this note, when I went after completing that project, and I went down to Civic Hall in Leeds City Council, and I sat with the chief of training. He said to me, well done, Claude, you know, it's good that you've done that, and I think it worked because you knew. But he said, you're only as good as your last 10 seconds. What are you going to do next? Which actually took the wind out of me, actually. And I thought, wow, you know, I've done all of this, and then not getting no credit. And so I went off and did work with young people. I did 20 years of developing, running youth projects for young people, because I do believe the summer holidays are the biggest corrupter of young people, especially in disadvantaged communities where young people don't have nothing to do. So I ran that, and I opened the cyber cafe. And so, yeah, that's my third 4 minutes.
That dream, talking about that dream and being able to like touch it and see it is really so beautiful to like envisage and to hold on to. And we absolutely love you, Claude. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and what I was saying, somebody said, yeah, I've got a YouTube page, Claude Hendrickson. And if you go on that, you can see it's about a 6-minute video that the Red Nose people, because they gave us some money to employ our site foreman. So there's if you go on YouTube, I've got a page, and it's got lots of videos about stuff that I've done.
Wicked. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Great. So we're going to move on to Kelsey. Kelsey, I'm going to just do a little bit of a intro. Many of you will know Kelsey. Is a feminist campaigner and full-time mischief maker based in London, organising campaigns against state violence and working to explore and build alternative support centering experiences of women of colour and other marginalised groups. A facilitator and grassroots collective a facilitator with grassroots collectives Cradle and Resist and Renew. She delivers training on bystander intervention, power and privilege, and tools for campaigning and movement building. So Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us. My first question for you is, you're a community organiser of Guyanese descent, and it'd be really great for you to share a little bit about how this identity has shaped your understanding of racial hierarchies, and maybe how this has changed over time.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kelsey. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to the two amazing speakers before me. Guyana, I guess, to put a little bit of context, which thank you, Nish, for sort of actually starting that off as well and giving that kind of wider context. We essentially, Guyana is a small country at the kind of top of South America, and like bordering Venezuela, and it's the history there is like based around so there's indigenous people who live in what we call the interior. Oh, nice. If you got any other Guyanese in the chat, let me know. We have indigenous people in the indigenous communities in the what we call the interior, and then sort of along the coast we have large Afro-Guyanese communities and Indo-Guyanese communities, and that kind of started with the Dutch and then the British bringing people that they had enslaved from Africa to work on mostly sugar plantations. And after the abolition of slavery, Indian people were then brought as indentured laborers to kind of start fulfilling that work that enslaved people had been doing. And that was a process that for some people it was forced. I mean, like pretty much everyone I believe that would have taken that journey would have been people who were lower caste in the first place. Yeah, some people were forced and some people actually were, promised and in many ways coerced, but in some ways definitely had aspirations of, I'm going to do better in this place in some kind of way. And so there's already kind of hierarchies that started to be embedded within that, because some people after their indentureship were given property or were given jobs and these kinds of things that people who had been enslaved weren't. And for me, really having seen sort of through my history, the way that just these little bits of opportunity that white supremacy gives you that entrenches into that can make all the difference to your heritage and where your family ends up. And for Guyana, there is always, for so many people in Guyana, I'm not going to say that I speak for everyone, but for me, it felt very much like the aspiration was to be English, and England was definitely this, which is synonymous almost with whiteness, right? And was definitely this thing of, if you could get out of Guyana, if you could go and be educated in England, then you've made it. And if you come back to Guyana, then you are right at the top of the class structure. But otherwise, even if you're a poor person in England, you are considered to be someone who's really done well for themselves. And for my family, where we see that on one side, on my grandmother's side, her father, I believe, must have been given a job or given land at some point, and so he owned some land, whereas my grandpa's heritage was that his family had been indentured and they'd been cane cutters, and he had just been one of the very few people from his rural community to make his way into Georgetown and eventually sort of marry up. And then from there, those aspirations to move to America, those kinds of things were really what they were aiming for. And Guyana has this kind of ongoing racial divides that have been politically I'm not an expert, and Guyana's political history is really complicated, but essentially by since independence, having two parties that have been divided essentially along racial lines has meant that I've been able to see that I guess just that race is purely that instrument of enforcing capitalism and white supremacy, right? And there's times that the strongest revolutionary moments have happened in Guyana have been when all of the colonial subjects have aligned together. And so whether that's been in revolts pre independence, or whether that's been through rioting and strikes and these kinds of things post-independence. And so yeah, I guess there's a few things there, which is like around the ways that we clearly like turn on each other in order to like, and that's kind of what imperialism has done in order to kind of make us like fight for the few resources that they have allowed us to access within Guyana, but also that for Indians, of course, like even though we say we don't have the caste system in Guyana, and even though lots of those people, as I said, would have been of lower castes when they arrived or when they left India, of course, like having been embedded in that culture and then embedded in imperialism and trying to assimilate into that, like essentially Indians have been able to lean into that caste system and recreate that through colorism and anti-Blackness. And we see that when people come to England too, right? And so I think there is like there's a responsibility that we have to take in understanding like where our alignment is and the ways that we benefit from those structures if we can, and the ways that we actually need to align ourselves with people who are at the sharpest end of oppression. Because only the thing with the like good immigrant narrative and those kinds of things is, of course, only a few of those people can get through, right? So even if like my immediate family has managed to through like deeply trying like on all these different stages, kind of like with my mum's father coming here in the Windrush generation in the 50s, but then returning to Guyana because it was still too hard to make any money here or do anything here, but then through that, like ensuring that we got the passports, ensuring that we got citizenship. And even when I was little and I was in Guyana, my parents put me and my brothers into like the year ahead in school and things like that, because they wanted us not to be struggling when we came to England. And luckily that meant that my sort of like integration into the school system here, it worked. It meant that I kind of didn't have to worry so much about learning and could change my accent and do these kinds of things that just meant that I could assimilate and sort of survive in this country. But then, I just, there's a responsibility to take there, right? Because like at whose expense do we do that? And I definitely have heard those same sentiments within like my elders, like conversations of my elders and things that are portraying those like colorist sentiments and anti-Black sentiments. Even though like the reality has been that, of course, it's whiteness that has been oppressive to us. And like I said, in Guyana, like the times when we have got the closest to liberation has been when we have like fought against those hierarchies and have actually like put those,
that was amazing.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you talk a little bit about how your parents or your family like influenced so much of how you kind of come into Britishness and whiteness, and taking me a bit of time to like forgive my dad for teaching me the codes and feeling like I'm trying to recover like who I am, because I've learned, I mean, like, had it drilled into me from as soon as I can remember about like how to pass both through class but also in many other ways. So transparently for audience, I'm going to go until 10 past. I realized that we'd scheduled to finish at 2, but having such great chats and I don't want to close up, so we're going to give space for that. So if you aren't able to stay, the recording will be shared, so or you can just get in touch with us for the recording. But Kelsey, I wanted to ask you, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think there's probably more to it specific to you. So on Cradle's community site, you refer to the collective's complex ancestries and identities as a strength in reaching across binaries and borders. And I just wanted you to share a bit about your personal kind of approach to racial justice organizing and what you take from that.
Yeah, so that's the thing, like I've had to like unlearn a lot, and it's been about actually like, for me, a key part of that has been to look at Guyanese history and to look at imperialism. And I think for me, like, because that history is so close, like, you know, like we think of these things as being historic, but like lots of like, yeah, it was our parents' generation that were fighting against, like we're fighting for independence and things, and it's really not that long ago. But for me, I guess it's made it easier to understand the importance of not just looking at racism on the British mainland, and to really see the limitations sometimes of the like race and class analysis that we like the limitations of that analysis, like if we focus just on, for example, like the left versus the right as opposed to the south versus the north, like and that actually when we focus on empire, we need to like that is what's going to be like key to our liberation. And for me, obviously as an abolitionist, looking at like policing and the history of prisons and seeing actually like police and prisons exist in response to the resistance of enslaved people and then indentured people. Like they created prisons because people never wanted to be exploited under imperialism. And so for me to know that like it is so deeply ingrained that that isn't a system that I'm trying to reform, that is a system that has always been there to oppress us, has directly oppressed my ancestors and the ancestors of people that we as Cradle collectively work with. Yeah, I think just learning more about that history of policing in the colonies has been really key to then understanding how we have to dismantle these systems, like not just here, but like worldwide. And so, you know, we see that through, you know, we could have a reformist movement. I won't go too much into abolition here, but like we could have a reformist movement in the UK and end up with prisons that are like the ones in Norway or Sweden or whatever, but like those prisons are sustained because of the militarization in the global south and because of the exploitation of people in the global south. And so that's not the liberation that we're looking for. That's not what we're like trying to build here. And so for me, it's a real lesson looking at our histories there and understanding that forever, like this has been the connection. So like there's also really underrated people, like I don't really understand, like just so much of our racial analysis and like revolutionaries are people who are either from here or America, but like people like Walter Rodney and Andai, their analysis that doesn't just look at class in the global north, but really looks at class in terms of imperialism and decolonizing, is so powerful. And Andai, you know, even though she was like the international secretary for the WPA, so she was like part of a political party, she and her comrades founded specifically a women's organization that was nonpartisan and was that still exists, and that's called Red Thread, that's in Guyana, and that serves Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese women, because understanding that like from a feminist perspective, when it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to sexual violence, when it comes to the oppression of women, that is like across all of these intersections as well, and that like for them that has been like a really important principle. And so that's something that I'm really like, yeah, has been really influential to me as well.
That's amazing. I'm going to ask you a final question,
yeah.
which I think really like touches on this too, which is your mission involves collective care and healing, as you mentioned, and in order to work towards building, I thought actually when you were, one thing that going back to the framework that we showed earlier, and we talked a little bit about the colonial mindset, which sits at the top, but one of those, what the other kind of like component of that is militarism, and just how essential like understanding policing and militarism has been in the establishment of capitalism, and specifically racial capitalism. So in that context, if your mission involves collective care and healing, and our shared in our shared strategy towards building an economic system rooted in racial justice, what investments do you feel we should be making in our own movements to enable that practice?
Yeah, and this is quite a difficult one, I guess, like in terms of investments. I guess for me, and it's kind of echoing a lot of what Claude was saying, and that you've done, Claude, which is that, like for me, I've been thinking a lot about the power of gathering intentionally, and the fact that I mean, like, firstly, the pandemic has been an incredibly lonely time, and we've seen the detriment that that's taken on people, on people's mental health and their physical health, etc. But a lot of our work before this as well was about getting together and like having these really important discussions and sharing these moments of healing and collective care, like over food, and not having been able to do that has been like really difficult in terms of our building like solidarity during this time. I think the power of like public assembly is the first thing that's taken away from us, right, under an authoritarian regime. Like, it's not, or not just in terms of like cracking down on protests, but also just like the slow gutting of our like ways to meet up with each other and spend time together through austerity, right? Because we're working more, they've taken away the youth centers, the community spaces, it's more expensive to go out for food, it's more expensive to buy food to cook for each other. It's, you know, like they make it harder for us to build community bonds and build that resilience and build those systems of care that are outside of the state. And that is very intentional, I think. And so the opposite of that, of course, is to like intentionally build those spaces, intentionally make space for us to spend time together, to like have those spaces for healing and exploring those things, and for organizing. And of course, housing, like if we could just build enough housing for everybody that was suitable for them, like people would be in a much better place all around, and we'd see the crime rate disappear and all of these things, right? And so and I guess, so for me, investment in like those spaces and for that as well, I guess, to really take an anti-colonial view of it is like to move beyond just this idea of owning property, is like about really like, how do we re-engage with the land? How do we re-engage with space? And how do we change our relationship with it so that it's not about ownership and it's about stewardship and these kinds of things that we learn from Indigenous communities and their fight for sovereignty. And I guess the other big thing for me, which I don't know how much of this is an investment, but the thing that capitalism steals from us, and the thing that we've been talking about a lot recently, particularly inspired by like the NAP ministry, but also like just this anti-imperialist view of like capitalism steals time from us to rest, and like whatever we can do to slow down, I think is like a priority, basically. Like something else that I've really learned, that I learned from like Caribbean culture, and like I genuinely like feel like I've been stressed ever since I came to this country, where I'm just a bit like, we do too much. Let's do less. Let's chill out a little bit. And I feel like the pace of things is too much. And we need to think about how we can, like, we can't do collective care in a rush. We can't have doctor's appointments that are 10 minutes.
Not even 10 minutes.
Yeah, literally, do you know what I mean? Like less than 10 minutes that are when you wait till something's wrong and then you go and have to do something about it. Like, what is a holistic, proactive, preventative like approach to our well-being that isn't just waiting for that? So I guess, yeah, those are my main sentiments. We've gone to 11 past. I know, haven't even taken any questions. Sorry.
I know. Noni sent me a private message being like, don't rush, it's all good. It's like trying to take in that, like,
I'm just trying to talk about
tyrant for timing.
Also, bye.
Okay, so yeah, so I am going to hang around for a little bit longer. We're not going to have a chance for doing questions, but you've got all of the speakers' handles for Twitter, and I'm sure they'd love to hear from you if you have a question for them. And if they don't message you back, then they don't message you back. But
one question, not even just a single question, just like a little one, just a tiny one.
All right, that can be the closing question, and then we can, that sounds good. Do we have a question in the chat?
And I think Claude has something that he'd like to say as well.
Yeah, I wanted to say something quickly on the back of what Kelsey has said. I think that yes, the system would have liked for even within this COVID to have shut us down. But what the internet and this platform has given us, which the system, that's why getting the internet has actually depowered the system in a funny kind of way. Yes, Donald Trump showed that it can empower, but it's the system has always pushed him back. So I think the fact that we've got COVID going on is the first time in the history of my life the whole system is in slow motion, and we have this platform that we can utilize during this downtime, so that when we start back again, we're ready for actually dealing with the system. So I think that let's not allow this COVID, this pandemic, to be a negative. Let's look at what we can take positive from it and how it's allowed us to network and keep going through this platform. I just wanted to make that, because sometimes we can be down and say, well, capitalism, hold on, capitalism has lost control. You know, internet and social media gives control to us, even though it's controlled in its facets by them, but it gives us the chance, even during a pandemic, to speak to people in the world. I just wanted to say that.
That was great, but wonderfully positive and optimistic. If we don't have any questions, I'm just going to ask Nish to maybe share their like final thoughts, having listened to the other two speakers, and then bring Kelsey in for the final word.
That's not my final word. That's just,
and then bring in Claude for the final word.
Yeah.
Nish, anything you wanted to reflect on before we leave?
No, I'm just really grateful for both Claude and Kelsey's knowledge. I do struggle a bit without captions, and Otter isn't the best with it, so I wasn't able to catch everything, but I was so inspired by the work both Claude and Kelsey are doing. And I do think that for me, I think a big thing around a lot of the work that we need to do is collectively organizing in ways which defeat sort of nation building, because I think that's like the most violent form of process of stratification that exists, and that directly ties to capitalism. But I only think that's possible with small things like Kelsey was talking about, and also Claude's directly done as well. So for me, it was like being part of a Food Not Bombs collective has basically blown my mind into like what kind of community care looks like, and how we can't expect to rely on governments to sort us out. And I think that's the heart of. And I think what the final thing I really want to say is that despite the rise of like specific groups of Indians who are very much wanting to oppress others, I think that it's important to remember that the history of British organising is collective under that sort of original black, sort of politically black angle. And while I don't think that term is useful anymore in the context of how we live, I think there is I have an aspiration of trying to rebuild that kind of connection and working with like marginalized people, racially marginalized people together, rather than like that very strict sort of divide. And I hope that this session doesn't create those sort of stratified sort of divide and conquer methods that is so commonly practiced by the right and also the rich. So I just wanted to end on that kind of, I really like, we can build futures together. It doesn't have to be divided. It's just acknowledging the power relations within that is important.
Thank you so much, Nish. Good point about the Otter as well, which is our first time trying it out. So I appreciate highlighting it, and we'll try and get it to a good functioning next time round. Claude, do you want to do your final words?
Yeah. What I would like to let people know is that I became the first community-led housing advisor, Black male community-led housing advisor nationally. And I'm now supporting groups that want to set up community-led housing projects and community land trusts, because the community land trust movement, even though it came to Europe and it's come to Britain, actually came out of the civil rights movement in America. And our natural thing is to look at gathering land. So what we can do on that land is what we want. So I'm a community land trust advisor. So if there's anybody out there, people out there that are interested in looking at setting up community land trust, setting up community-led housing projects, because we have a role in history to prepare the next generation to deal with what is coming. You know, at the end of the day, our role in life is to ensure the next generation do not have the same issues, or they're better informed. So going forward, I want to be positive and say we can ensure change will happen. Change is happening, maybe not as quick as we want it to do. A police officer is going to jail for George Floyd. It's the first one. There has to be a first one. Another police officer in the UK is going to jail for kicking that footballer. It takes time to make change. We're trying to turn a big elephant around. So let us be positive in that events like this, informing each other and being supportive of each other, will make change happen. So thank you for the invite. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claude. And Kelsey, final word to you. You're good?
I don't have much to add, really. Thank you so much for today. This has been really interesting to hear everyone speak, and like I'm looking forward to connecting with Claude and Nish after this as well, hopefully.
Sounds grand. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. The run over was well worth it. And we're gonna play a little bit of outro music maybe, and then let you go at your own pace. More events happening in the coming weeks, and there's a special announcement on our Instagram later this week or early next week. So just look out for that. And if you know anyone who is up for contributing to the crowdfunder, we'd be really grateful for that. And if you're involved in a project that needs some exposure and you want to get in touch with us, we are more than happy to share that on our Twitter page and Instagram as well. And we just love meeting people. So speak to you all soon, and have a great afternoon. And thanks so much to the speakers and the team